copy that behavior, and then we both gain weight. Or conversely, you make other recommendations to me regarding my behavior, or I watch you, or the like. So what's spreading from me to you is a behavior. Another possibility is that alters appearance or behavior changes ego's expectations or perceptions of norms. Here, what spreads from person to person is not a behavior, but rather an idea, right? I look at other people around me, and I make decisions about what an acceptable body size is based on looking at the people around me. Now, we think that there's evidence in our data to support the latter more than the former. And it comes from the two pieces of evidence that I alluded to. We're not claiming we know this for sure, but we interpret our findings to be more consistent with the latter than the former in two ways. First, the lack of decay with geographic distance we think is more consistent with a spread of norms than a spread of behaviors, because we think ideas can leap a great distance in a way that, that behaviors cannot. If I see my brother Dimitri once a year at Thanksgiving, and I copy his eating behavior that day, I can eat all I want that day, but it's not going to make me gain a ton of weight. But I can see him and say, oh my God, he's bigger. And it can change. I can internalize a different vision of what an acceptable body size is, even from a more ephemeral or transient contact. Okay? And second, I showed you we looked at one specific behavior, namely smoking, and controlled for the spread of smoking, and even so, we didn't find that it changed our results. So at least with respect to one behavior, it wasn't that behavior that was spreading. Something else was going on. Okay? So we think that actually what may be going on here is this notion of a spread of norms. Let's look a little bit more about smoking. These results will be published soon, but they haven't been published yet. This shows the smoking behavior clusters within the Framingham Heart Studies social network. Again, what we do now is we color the nodes according to how many cigarettes you smoke. And if you smoke more than 30 cigarettes, we color you yellow. We make the node size bigger if you smoke more cigs. And if you see in 1971, pretty much most of the people are smoking. The prevalence of smoking in the country at the time was about 45% or 50%. In our network, it's about 60%. And by the year 2000, you see no more smoking, right? There's been a kind of substantial decline in smoking in our society. And this little thing here zooms in here, okay, on this little circle. Now, when you look at these things, there are a number of patterns. When you look at these images, there are a number of patterns that are apparent. First of all, by 2000, it's apparent that smokers are more likely to occur at the periphery of their networks. So if you look at this little subnetwork, can you see here that these people, the smokers, occur at the margins of their social networks? They are no longer located near the center of the network as a whole, or their subnetworks, or the local areas where they're located. Second, you can also see that there's been a kind of well, you can't see it so easily with this image, but there's been a kind of separation. Like the smokers, here's a cluster of smokers over here. There's another one over here. They tend to stick together, okay? So there's a kind of a polarization that's occurred. Just like we've seen in our country increasing polarization along political lines, there's been a kind of polarization of smokers. Smokers are kind of in their own parts of the network, and non-smokers are in a different part of the network. An analysis similar to those that we did for obesity showed that on average, these clusters of non-smokers stretched out to about 3 degrees. But additional analyses that we did in the smoking results show a couple of very interesting findings. This slide shows cluster size and centrality of smokers from 1971 to 2003 in our network. If you look first at the left panel, what it shows is the mean smoking cluster size in the observed network versus a network that is a random network. So what we do here is we took the network, we looked at the prevalence of smokers that's declining across time, and we said if we randomly distributed that prevalence within the network, what would be the average cluster size? And as you might have some intuition, as the proportion of smokers declines across time, if the smokers were being randomly distributed, what you would find is that the cluster size of smokers would decline, right? Because the probability that they would have a contact who's also a smoker would decline. But that's not what you see. You see relative stability in the size of the smokers clusters across time. So that's the first fact. Fact number one is that the smoker cluster size stays the same for 30 years. Fact number two is that the population prevalence of smoking has declined across time. How do you square those two pieces of data? How can that be? How can it be that the number of smokers in the population has declined hugely in 30 years, but the size of the clusters of smokers has remained the same? Yeah, what's happening is that whole groups of people are quitting at once. They're quitting in droves. So the decision to quit smoking is not being made by isolated individuals. Something changes in the social fabric. The people around me, the norm switches. We're not supposed to be smokers anymore. And we all quit together. So whole clusters of smokers drop out of the network. So the average cluster size stays the same. The remaining clusters are the same. The prevalence declines. Cluster size stays the same. This kind of network analysis gives you a kind of insight into what's happening that you could never get from a more regression-based modeling framework. On the right, what we show is what's happening to the centrality of the smokers. We use something known as eigenvector centrality, which lies at the core of Google's PageRank system that determines which pages are most central and important in the network. And what we find is that the centrality of the non-smokers stays about the same across time, but the centrality of the smokers declines, meaning that the smokers are being increasingly pushed to the periphery of the network, are more polarized, are more marginal, are no longer as important or as central. Finally, dyadic analyses similar to those we did for obesity show a dyadic spread in smoking cessation, but the dynamics are quite different. When we looked at educational status, what we found is that more educated individuals were both more influential and more influenceable. So for example, if I have two different friends, one of whom is uneducated, one of whom is educated, in the situation in which my educated friend quits smoking, I'm much more likely to copy that friend than in the counterfactual situation in which my uneducated friend quits. So my response to an alter quitting is modified by the educational status of the alter. And similarly, my educational status depends on my response to the stimulus. If I'm more educated, I'm more likely to quit smoking when you quit than if I'm less educated. This observation comports with a huge literature on the adoption of innovation amongst populations more generally that shows that high-status individuals are more likely to adopt them. Now, we're also beginning to think about exploiting certain other features in our data, including information about food consumption, exercise, drinking, and the like. And this is just a slide that shows banana eating in the Framingham Heart Study Social Network. If you eat bananas more than once a day, we color you yellow. If you don't, we color you red. And here you can see a cluster of banana eaters that are living very peacefully right next to a cluster of non-banana eaters without a lot of tension. So we're beginning to think about trying to see, is there a spread of eating behavior in the network, and can we begin to understand those choices as well? But we've also started to look at phenomena such as the spread of happiness. Emotional contagion is known to occur over dyads over short periods of time. So what do you do when someone smiles at you in the subway? You smile back. Okay? It's just a normal biological process. It's called Duchenne smiling. It's felt to have evolved from the play face that chimpanzees show. It's just a normal behavior. Some economists have done some very clever studies that look at this process of, and psychologists, looking at this process of emotional contagion. One experiment that I particularly like is training waitresses to smile. Raise your hands if you've waited tables. Yeah. So they train the waiters and waitresses to smile in the course of their serving the tables that night, versus another group that was not given the smiling treatment. And then they, because they're economists, they have a nice thing that they can measure, they added up the amount of tips that the waitresses got if they smiled versus if they didn't smile, and they found that the amount of tips went way up just from teaching people to smile. Okay? Another very clever study that was done looked at, in college settings, looked at people who, at a university where people were randomly assigned roommates when they came in, and they looked at what happened to your mood when you were randomly assigned to have a really depressed and bummed out roommate. And if you had a bummed out roommate, your probability of being bummed out 3 months later was much higher. So it would be like an experiment where I could randomly assign you to having an unhappy social contact, right? And they found that it was really depressing. Interestingly, Bruce Sacerdote, an economist at Dartmouth, did a study, lest some of you get too hasty, looking at whether your GPA improves if you have not a depressed roommate, but if you have a studious roommate, and in fact it does. If you're randomly assigned, as they do at Dartmouth, which is typical of Dartmouth, if you're randomly assigned a roommate, then who's a good studious student, your grades improve. So there's contagion in a variety of things. In particular here, we're talking about happiness. But our question was, can happiness spread over longer time periods, not just fleeting smile at someone on the subway over seconds or weeks, but can it spread over time periods lasting a year? And more interestingly, can it spread not just dyadically from person to person, but